Hey guys, so this is AP World History, Chapter 24, Part 2. So we have talked about the European, especially the Spanish and the Portuguese, and the labor systems that they have. So remember, with the Spanish, they had the encomienda and they had the mita system as well in order to get slave labor into their mines to work their mines. And we saw with the Portuguese that they had the engenho system to work in their sugar plantations. So just remember that for the most part, this was pretty much labor that was done by the indigenous, and if not by the indigenous, the slaves were the ones also performing the labor. And we see this especially with the Portuguese with the engenho because just of the heat and the conditions and the poor ways that they would take care of them. We saw a lot of them die because of this, so they would get the slaves to come in, and the African slaves in particular to come in and work for them. So now we're going to move on to, we're going to look up into North America in terms of what they did for kind of production and stuff. So we look at tobacco and other cash crops. So for the English, one main cultivation was tobacco, and this was a very, very popular cash crop during this time, and it will be for 100 years, several years. And it was popular because of its addictive nature. We all know that we know it's addictive. Back then, they did not see it as addictive, and at first they thought it was actually going to be something that was beneficial, was going to have these health benefits for it, and they would use it as teas. They would use it to heal illnesses and stuff like that. But obviously, much later on, we find out, and it's not until the 20th century that we find out that it's actually has negative effects to it. Other crops that they grew, cash crops besides tobacco, if they were tobacco farmers, at times they would also grow indigo and rice as well. So the way that they had their labor system going was through indentured labor. So indentured servants essentially worked off whatever debt they had in return for freedom. So sometimes they needed to come to the colonies, or they wanted to come to the colonies, and they didn't have a way, some people, to get there, and they knew somebody who was going to go over there, who lived there. And so what they said was, you know what, if you get me on this ship and you get me to, the colonies, then I'll work my way to my freedom, essentially. So that's what indentured labor was, an indentured servant. Um, some blacks were indentured servants before this idea of slavery, before Africans were used as chattel slavery. Some blacks were indentured servants, and others fell into a permanent servitude where it was like, I'm going to be this indentured servant, but you're never going to pay me enough, or I'm never going to be able to work off my debt. So they just kind of become slaves. Virginia law was one of the first to recognize all blacks as slaves in America. And so it kind of shifted from even being indentured labor to just straight being a slave if you were black. So although the South was seen as the area that used slaves prominently, all North American colonies participated in the slave trade. And of course, you're going to see this prominently in the South because this is where you have most of your cash crops happening. But early on, when, 1600s to 1865, it was slavery primarily in the South, but it was also occurring in the North as well. So some questions for you to think about. What other crops do those in North America find lucrative? What was indentured servitude? Discuss what slavery was. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Christianity and the native religions in Americas. So it's one of the ways, remember, I told you in the past screencast, one of the motives for coming into the Americas was God, glory, and gold, the three G's. And God played a role, especially with the Spanish and the French and English at a time, some, but mostly with the Spanish and the Portuguese. So the Spanish, they had Roman Catholic priests serve as missionaries and representatives of the crown. Again, this motive of God, glory, gold. So here comes the God part, where these missionaries are coming into these lands and they are converting the natives. And it was there also to reinforce the administration that once you convert, that also means you're going to be following the Spanish crown and what the Spanish crown wants of you. And that's going to make you a good Christian. So many times they attempted to convert indigenous peoples and make Christianity understandable and relatable. So at times we're going to see these missionaries come in and they're going to kind of blend the native ideas that they already hold in terms of religion with the Christian ideas. And at first, converts are very hard to come by because the natives stuck to their original faith. They didn't see the reason to need to convert to Christianity. And so priests would win converts in Spanish America by blending these ideas, making a blend of Catholicism and their native traditions. They said, you know what? We know you have saints or, these smaller deities that you also worship. We also have these venerations, smaller, we also have these saints that we worship, these old people who have contributed to Christianity. One of the big ways that they did this was through the Virgin of Guadalupe. The mestizos embraced the Virgin as a national symbol. They felt that they could relate to her, especially the way that she looked. She was, of darker skin. She seemed to look the way they did. Miracles, they believed that miracles happened when you visited her shrine, and they had made it distinct to the Mexican faith. The Mexicans, Hispanics, Latinos, they look to the Virgin, and to them they can relate. And so this helped to solidify Catholicism in Mexico, and it helped to bring in more converts because they had that relatability to it. In terms of the French and English missions, the missionaries for the French and English did not attract as many converts as they did in Spanish America. The indigenous were not as sedentary, and what that has to do with the conversion is that in these areas where the French and the English were, the Indians, or the natives, were moving from place to place because they were either displaced by the English or the French, or they were hunting, so it became very hard to have them settle down and just try to preach the faith to them. So that was why this being that they were not sedentary would hurt the conversion. And there was actually little effort to attempt to convert. Remember, the French and the English, they didn't see the natives as being a part of their society. Rather, they saw them as almost an intrusion, especially the English did. So it didn't necessarily help with conversion. Okay, so questions. What role did Catholicism play in colonization? Why was the Virgen de Guadalupe important? All right, so the last section we're going to look at is Europeans in the Pacific, Australia, and the larger world. So we see the Dutch settlers first to sight Australia in 1606, like really the first ones to go in, see what's there, settle, and look at the area. And they really didn't find anything interesting, meaning that they probably didn't find any resources that they could necessarily exploit and use to benefit them. But they did, they found New Guinea and Tanzania, which was named after New Holland, which was meant New Holland. And a few contacts with indigenous people they saw them as savages. They really saw them as like people who were below them, because of the way they looked, the way that they dressed, probably the fact that they didn't think they were civilized because they didn't look like them, essentially. In terms of British colonists in 1770, Europeans became more interested in Australia. They saw a little bit more value to it, and they took a fleet of convicts and established a penal colony there. So it was pretty much like almost a prison colony to an extent. That if you were a convict, if you committed some sort of crime, or they did not want you because you were, thought you were going to commit another crime if you already had, then they were going to take you to Australia, and that's where you were going to pretty much establish yourself. So this began more encounters between the Aboriginals and the Europeans as they began to take more and more people to to Australia, to that area. When we look at the Pacific Islands in the larger world, the Spanish voyages in the Pacific are there. Spain will reach Guam in the Philippines, and they'll establish themselves there. Some people will settle there and live there. And so if you think about it, when you see people from the Philippines and they, have similar last names to to Mexicans or Hispanics, it's because of this colonization that existed at this time. They also brought in, for the first time, they inaugurated the Manila galleons there, which are just massive ships. And they did not establish regular communications necessarily with these areas. In terms of Guam in particular, we see that the Spanish are very interested in it. There's this peaceful trade with the Chamorro who are there, and the Spanish will attempt to impose rule, but this native group will oppose them. But of course, it was very difficult for them to refuse because, one, we have these military technologies that are better than the ones they have there, and two, of course, epidemic disease will kill much of the population. So Spanish forces will eventually be able to establish garrisons, and they will relocate the Chamorros under supervised territories. And then finally, visitors and trade with Captain Cook. So in the 18th century, we brought sharp increase of visitors into the Pacific. Remember, James Cook, he was the one that really chartered the Pacific Islands, and he also charted them, meaning he mapped them out. Mostly peaceful, but occasional skirmishes, especially when the crew of Captain Cook, they were being attacked by the Hawaiians, but that's because the Hawaiians thought that, they had taken stuff from them. And Cook saw Hawaiians related to the Tahitians, and they at first, like I said, got along well, and then sailors and women often consorted, and sailors at times would begin to live there. But really what helped with Cook is that he brought back many Europeans into the Pacific and kind of showed them like, hey, look, there's this whole other area there. All right, so that is the end of part 2 for chapter 24. Again, very, very important that you understand the differences in the way the Spanish and the Portuguese treated the indigenous and how they established in the Americas versus the way that the French and the English established themselves in the Americas. I would look at labor systems. How did labor affect it? I would look at how religion affected both sides. I would look at the reasoning behind it as well. And I would kind of also think of how, or why the reasoning was for them to fit one group in. Why did Spanish and Portuguese blend or bring in the natives, whereas the English and the French really didn't have that kind of relationship?